good, everyone? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel. Good day, folks. So today we have the pleasure of talking to Morley Robbins, aka the Magnesium Man, and the founder of the Root Cause Protocol. What? You're gonna want to stay tuned for what the Root Cause Protocol is. So Morley Robbins got his bachelor's in biology and then his master's in healthcare administration, but he spent the last 10 plus years doing his own research to uncover what he believes to be the root cause of human disease. So we'll be doing a series of videos with Morley Robbins, so stay tuned for the future videos where we will uncover what he believes to be the root cause, which breaks down to mineral imbalances. So let's get started. All right, Morley Robbins, thank you so much for coming on our channel today to discuss all things mineral. I would describe you as like a mineral advocate. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
very good term.
Tell our audience a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Let's see, how much time do I want to take on? No, I was born into a very sickly family, and it's a miracle that I'm as healthy as I am. But when I was in college, I had visions of being a doctor because my sister was a nurse. So of course, I had to be the doctor. Except that I didn't have the academic discipline to study. I didn't understand why I was learning the Doppler effect, and I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. That made no sense to me. So I went through with the process. I only got rejected by 18 medical schools. And of course, at the time, I thought it was because I wasn't smart. But over the years, I've come to realize that actually what medical schools are looking for are people who follow the rules. They don't want people who are heretics and ask questions and think outside the box. So it's been a fascinating journey. When I didn't get into medical school, I decided to go into business. And then, if you can't be a doctor, you boss them around. So I became a hospital executive. Nice. And did that for 12 years. And then decided I wanted to take it up a notch. And I became a management consultant. And for 20 years, I traveled the country solving problems that hospitals were having and really focused on getting them to be bigger and faster and smarter. And now, later in my life, I'm working overtime to try to empty those hospitals. It's been a fascinating journey. But about 11 years ago, I developed what's called a frozen shoulder, where I couldn't pick my hand up above my waist. And it was from 20 years of pulling a suitcase from behind me, going through airports, what have you. And so I went to a health food store that I had frequented for many years and explained what the problem was. I wasn't sleeping. And they said, well, you need to go see Dr. Liz. And I went, I don't do witchcraft, just give me some supplements. And they didn't do anything. So a couple months later, I go back. And I said, you must have something stronger. And the owner of the store looked me in the eye and she said, Morley, we love you. Go see Dr. Liz. So with my tail between my legs, I went to see Dr. Liz Erkenswick, who was a very, she had a thriving chiropractic practice in Evanston. And I lived in Evanston. I'd never heard of her. In any event, within 2 sessions, I had the complete rotation and movement of and I was like, what just happened? Because doctors wanted to operate. I knew that wasn't the right thing to do. And so, long story short, Dr. Liz is my wife, and she introduced me to natural healing. And it's been an amazing journey that when we first met, she made a comment about the innate healer, like the innate healer. And she's talking about how it's inside our body. I'm like, yeah, right. And I said this to myself. I'm like, so there's hundreds of thousands of doctors all over the world, and we have a healer inside us. So I thought quietly to myself, she's crazy. But I was too enamored with the recovery of my shoulder to really challenge it. But now I know who the innate healer is. I know exactly what the chemical is. And we'll talk about that in our conversation. But there really is a molecule inside our body that plays this profound role of keeping us in balance. And it is the innate healer. And it's not taught in doctor school. It's not taught in nursing school. It's not taught in any therapy school, because that would kill the business model of medicine. So it's been a fascinating journey. And as a lark, I started researching. I was really intrigued by, why is everyone so sick? I thought that was an interesting question to try to understand. And somehow I stumbled on magnesium, was my first love. And
After Liz.
absolutely. What's that?
After Liz. So it went Liz.
After Liz, right? Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, get that right. And so I thought that we just needed more magnesium. And a practitioner who I really respected said, Morley, if it was that simple, we would have figured that out. And I, in my arrogance, thought, well, obviously you don't understand it the way I do. And of course, I was wrong. This practitioner was right. And I then came upon copper, and then came upon bioavailable copper, completely different. And then came upon iron. Oh my gosh. And then stumbled into oxidative stress. And then that got me to oxygen. And it's been an amazing synthesis of all of that over the last 11 years. And we'll have a chance to chat about that.
That's a great place to start, though.
Yeah.
Just diving into the whole concept of iron overload. We do not know enough about it here to ask any valid starting question.
But I think that it's very common, especially for women, to be told that you are anemic. And a lot of blood work that women get shows that they are iron deficient. I have had this blood work. I have had iron pills prescribed to me. I've been on numerous birth control pills that were high in iron. And so it just seems like so many people, so many doctors, and so many prescriptions have iron in them.
Mm-hmm.
How did it get this way, and why do you think that it's a big problem?
Okay, so that's a wonderful launching point.
Good.
But let's start at the beginning. Okay, so we live on a planet that didn't always have oxygen. So for billions of years, there was no oxygen on the planet. And then something that the astrobiologists, there really are people who study biology in the stars, it's just like mind-blowing, but they ascertained that about 3.5 billion years ago, there were cyanobacteria in the ocean that started to engage in what we now know as photosynthesis. It's fascinating. So what does photosynthesis do? It gives off oxygen. And when that started to happen, when there was only 0.1% oxygen in the atmosphere, it wiped out 99% of life on this planet. What was the life on this planet living on back then? It was living on iron and sulfur. There was no oxygen. But when oxygen shows up, suddenly we have a crisis. What happened? Well, oxygen and iron, they don't mix well together, do they? They create what's called rust. And so we recognize rust, rusty nail or a rusty pipe or a rusty car. We know what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
But it never occurred to us that it was happening inside our body. And so we now live in an environment that has 21% oxygen in the air. Well, it's not just a gas, it's the second most reactive element on the planet after fluoride. Fluoride is not your friend. It's a violent chemical or element. And oxygen is right on the heels of it. And when the planet was confronted with this crisis of oxygen, it needed something to manage it. Well, that something is called copper. And through evolution, through a long time, there's a whole series of enzymes that began to emerge that allowed for the proper harnessing of oxygen. And it's the reason why we're here, the reason why we're having this conversation is because copper saved us from oxygen. And it's a very different way to think about the world. And what does copper do? It's the only element on planet Earth that can harness oxygen and regulate iron, so we don't get oxidative stress. And so copper activates oxygen in our mitochondria and turns oxygen into water to release the energy precursor molecules called ADP. And that happens in something called complex 4. And then they go over to complex 5, which that enzyme is called ATP synthase. And it's a little rotor, it's a little motor.
Tiny nanomotor, the fastest
Yeah.
motor in the world.
Right, spinning at 9,000 revolutions per minute. Your car redlines at 6,000. So things, and it's not just a rotor, but bazillions of rotors, because there are bazillions of mitochondria in our body. And so we actually have 40 quadrillion mitochondria. Now let that number sink in. It's a lot of mitochondria.
Gosh, I don't know how big that
is. Well, that's 40 quadrillion is, I think it's 15 zeros.
Okay.
Big, right?
Big, pretty big.
So nine zeros is a billion, 12 zeros is a trillion, and 15 zeros is quadrillions. So it's a lot of mitochondria.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of these little rotors in them.
Yeah.
Right? So for the listeners to get a context of this, so we have a heart that beats 72 times a minute, ideally, right?
Okay.
Each heartbeat requires 1 billion ATP. The numbers get really big really fast.
Yeah.
And so, like the heart, there's I don't know how many heart muscle cells there are. They're called cardiomyocytes, but each one has 10,000 mitochondria per cell. 10,000 mitochondria
Per cell.
per cell. Now, what's fascinating is women who have mature egg cells, there should be 600,000 mitochondria per egg. 600,000. So do you think if a woman is having trouble with her menstrual cycle, it might have something to do with her ability to make energy and to support that process?
Yeah.
Now here's what's buried, and I'm not going to lose sight of the original question, trust me. But I think it's important for the listeners to understand that the way our body works is vastly different than the way the internet is trying to teach us, or the way our doctors try to intimidate us. So each mitochondria, if go back to your high school textbook, science textbook, and there's a picture of the cell and there's a picture of mitochondria, and it's got this funky shaped swimming pool inside, right?
Yeah.
That's called the matrix. And it's supposed to have 50,000 atoms of copper in each mitochondria.
Okay, hold on one second. So you're saying that copper is required to reduce the amount of iron to reduce oxidative stress. And so if we have too much, did I say that wrong?
You did, that's right. You said that right. Yep.
If we have too much iron, that causes oxidative stress and we have reduced energy production. And so you can think
we can stop talking right now. You get it.
So you can think of like those nanomotors are getting rusty.
Exactly.
They don't spin as fast, they don't spin as well, and they produce harmful reactive oxidative ROS.
Exactly. Each of those nanomotors is supposed to produce 27,000 ATP per minute.
I just don't even like.
It's like we need a Cray computer to figure this out, right?
Yeah.
So we've got 40 quadrillion mitochondria times 50,000 atoms of copper. And when was the last time your doctor talked to you about your copper status?
Never.
Never? No, of course not. So the original question that Sarah was asking is, so everyone's got an iron problem. How did this happen? Where did all this insanity start? It's absolutely fascinating that this really began in the early teens of the 1900s, just before the First World War, and then really ticked up after the First World War, the League of Nations and whatever the health group that was attached to it started studying the anemia of pregnancy. Now, for the followers, for the listeners, anemia originally meant low hemoglobin in the blood. It did not mean low iron. Okay, so hemoglobin has been studied from 1860 to 1972. That was the marker that was used to define, do we have adequate hemoglobin? Do we have adequate oxygen carrying capacity? And that was the clinical standard. And in this early 1900 studies, they were discovering that, lo and behold, women who were pregnant were becoming anemic as the pregnancy progressed. And by the third trimester, it might go down below 10. Horrors. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. And so they, instead of saying, wow, Mother Nature must be really smart, they turned it into a disease. So they turned it into an iron shortage, an iron deficiency. And then they started promoting iron just before the advent of the Second World War. And so this is all contrived science, because a very important study was done by an obstetrician in the UK. His name is Philip Steer, S-T-E-R, Philip J. Steer. And he studied 150,000 live births. I would have been impressed if he had done 1,500, but he did 150,000 live births. And what he was looking for was, what is the hemoglobin of the mother who produce, of the mothers who produce the healthiest babies? And what do you think the numbers were that he found?
They were low.
They were low, exactly. Between 8.5 and 9.5, where that was the hemoglobin level of the moms who produce the healthiest children. And that flies in the face of convention today, because obstetricians, nurse midwives, doulas, they're all trained that it better be, you got to keep it above 12. And if it gets below 12, you should get nervous. And if it gets below 10, oh my God, we've got a crisis on our hands.
So you're saying that the depletion of iron during a pregnancy is like a protective mechanism?
Well, let's be careful the words we use, right? It isn't a depletion. What's happening, it's a really good question. We have to be really careful of words. The term is called hemodilution. The hemoglobin is, there's a constant supply of hemoglobin, but it's being distributed in an increasing volume of fluid, more blood, more amniotic fluid. And so it isn't that there's a hemoglobin deficiency, it's that the units need to be adjusted for the increased blood volume in the mom's body. So it's an absolute cornerstone of obstetrics, is hemodilution. And yet I don't think practitioners today know what we're talking about, which is a real source of concern. And so women now are being terrorized that if they want to have a natural birth, you better keep your hemoglobin above 12, because you're going to bleed out otherwise, and we can't have a natural childbirth if you don't have your hemoglobin up. And it's like, it's insane science that they're using, and it's creating a real crisis in the mother's body, and it's creating a crisis in the baby's body. I have two clients who are on opposite ends of the country, who both got iron infusions a week before they delivered. Oh. Both women almost died, and both babies almost died. And the doctors didn't understand what the problem was.
So
Go ahead.
Hemoglobin, like the low levels of hemoglobin, they give iron diffusions?
Yeah, can you explain how the hemoglobin and iron, like that connection
Where
is
did it get crossed over?
The connection, that's a missing link in my head right now.
It's a really good question. have you ever been to a carnival where there's a barker who's got walnut shells moving around and he's got a pea underneath it, and you're trying to extract? Well, that's iron biologists,
Oh.
and they're using terminology, and so a real curveball was thrown our way in 1972 when some hematologists in the UK, Jacobs et al., 1972, decided that, hey, stop worrying about this hemoglobin thing. Let's turn our attention to serum ferritin. That's the marker you want to focus on. Well, it turns out, in fact, and what's implied in your question, because there is a lot of confusion around it, is that measuring iron status in the human body is a three-ring circus. Because there's three completely different ways of measuring iron status. One is hemoglobin, which was measured for over 100 years, looking at hemoglobin status. And in a healthy man's body, it should be around 14, and in a healthy woman's body, about 12 and a half, 13.
Are those positively correlated? So a higher amount of hemoglobin means a higher amount of iron in your body?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And so think of it this way, hemoglobin, so it's heme and globin protein, and there's 4 heme in hemoglobin, and each heme protein has an iron atom at the core, and each iron is holding oxygen.
Okay.
Okay, so iron, really, that's where 70% of the iron in our body is found in hemoglobin.
Okay.
70%. And iron is a waiter carrying oxygen. Okay, that's all it does. It's just carrying oxygen. And it's, in my humble opinion, it's a dumb waiter. There's another 10% that's in something called myoglobin, which is in our muscles, and it holds oxygen in the muscles. So when we're going to do a workout or whatever, we've got the oxygen we need. Yeah, exactly. So that's where 80% of our iron is tied up.
Those two.
Those two. So then there's something called an iron recycling program. The fancy term for it, the clinical term for it, is called reticuloendothelial system. And it took me about 2 years to figure out what that really means. It means recycling. That's all it means. So it's called the RES. So I just turned it into the recycling system. And so what that system does is every 24 hours, our body needs to come up with 24 milligrams of iron. And we need 1 milligram from our diet, not 18. We need 1 milligram from our diet. And then that enables our body, our bone marrow in our long bones, to make the next day's batch of red blood cells. We need about 250 billion new red blood cells every day. And they live for about 120 days if everything's going according to plan. 120 days. But if you're struggling with minerals, and if you especially have a shortage of magnesium and a shortage of bioavailable copper, the 120-day lifespan goes down to 20 days. And have you ever seen the show Lucy at the Chocolate Factory? When the manager says, "Speed it up, boys," and then suddenly Lucy and Ethel they're just going like crazy. And that's what's happening inside people's body who are minerally deficient, is there's so much turnover, they can't keep up with it. And so when you've got that kind of turnover, there's going to be handoff errors. Think about it. You're trying to move reactive elements like iron and oxygen, and we're doing it really fast. And the faster it goes, the more chances for error. So about 4% of the iron in our body is tied up in this recycling program. And that shows up as serum iron on a blood test. So we've got hemoglobin, serum iron, and then the third category, and the most confusing, is called serum ferritin. Now, we could spend an hour just talking about the insanity of ferritin. But again, our friends in England, 1972, says, let's start focusing there. And on one level, there's validity to it, but they didn't tell us the full story. So we're measuring, it's an intracellular protein. This protein is supposed to be inside the cell, inside the tissue, not outside the cell in the blood. Blood is not an intracellular medium.
Yeah.
The blood is outside, right?
Yeah.
So that when serum ferritin starts to change, it means we have a problem in our body. It means we have pathology in our body. And what happens is if there's some chaos in our liver, the ferritin will rise, and it's the classic sign of inflammation. I've got a client whose ferritin is 550. Well, it should be around 20. And so when it gets up into the hundreds, and it can get up into the thousands, that's a classic clinical sign of inflammation. And doctors are not taught that that's a problem. And then if it gets into the low numbers, low teens and single digits, when everyone starts to freak out, that's spleen is the problem. Spleen is not getting, it's not functioning right. And so that's about 10% of the iron, but it's supposed to be inside the cell. And there's a very noted iron biologist named Douglas Kell, who I've spoken with a couple of years ago. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Kell, what's the ideal ferritin for a human being? And he said, 0. I went, what? He said, Morley, I want to make sure you understand this. He said, a high level of ferritin is not a sign of iron vitality. It is a sign of organ pathophysiology. Do you understand that? And I went, yes, I do. And I've remembered that saying, or that conversation. It was like it was a light bulb moment. And so there's a lot of confusion in the field. And so because of this theory ring circus, doctors don't always do all 3 markers, and you absolutely have to if you really want to understand what's going on.
Can we review the 3 markers that you would test, and then what is typically tested?
The 3 markers would be hemoglobin, serum iron, and serum ferritin.
But then what blood test did I probably get and she get that said, oh, you're anemic?
Very likely it was a ferritin blood test.
Okay.
So I just gave a talk up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to the Amish farmers. And so I wanted to make sure that I was making this as simple and as clear as possible. And so when I was talking about ferritin, I said, so if you need to count the number of bales of hay in your barn, would you then go out in the field and start counting them out there? And they were like, no.
Speaking our language there. We're farmers, so like the bales of hay, I get it. Okay.
Get it. And here's the other analogy that I use with them. I said, and so then what they didn't tell us is that there's 2 forms of ferritin. There's something called heavy chain, which means it can load iron. And then there's light chain, which it's very different. Well, they're as different as square bales and round bales of hay. Okay, you got that? See how simple this is? And so that's not taught in doctor school. And they don't know that there's actually a 3rd form of ferritin. So we've got the heavy chain, the light chain. And when there's this pathology in the organ, the ferritin gets cleaved. It loses about 18 amino acids. The iron is discharged into the organ, and then the organ secretes that protein into the blood as an indication to the person, we got a crisis going on. Pay attention.
Oh, okay, hold on. So people measure the serum ferritin, and that's a protein.
Correct, that's right.
And
it's supposed to be inside the cell.
Yeah, they correlate that to your iron level. But in reality, that ferritin should still be inside that cell. That protein should still be bound to that iron inside the cell. If it's functioning properly. If it's not functioning properly, you just have a loose iron element inside the cell and it releases the ferritin protein.
You got it. You both are now certified iron biologists of the highest order, and you can run circles around any doctor you've ever met.
What is a healthy ferritin level then?
0.
Well,
I know he said 0, but he
well,
said
I spotted at 20 because the reason why I don't adopt Dr. Kell's position is that would be heretical. People just say that doesn't make any. There's a point where you just have to get a number out there that's defendable. And the pivot point that I'm seeing in clients is around 20. If it's between 20 and 35, everything seems to be okay. When it starts to get below 20, that becomes an issue. And when it gets above 150 in a woman, and when it's above 300 in a guy, then it's the bookends of those markers where the problems seem to surface. And it isn't, again, the mindset that we've been trained by is I have an iron deficiency. No. You have iron dysregulation. And because you don't have enough bioavailable copper in your body, and most people don't, they can't regulate the iron handoffs that are supposed to be taking place in the body. And the challenge is that iron started to disappear on the farm about 100 years ago. Copper started to disappear on the farm about 100 years ago. Sorry about that. So copper started to disappear. It's considered by some to be the #1 nutrient deficiency on the farm is copper deficiency.
You mean in the soil?
In the soil. And if it's not in the soil, it's not in the plant. If it's not in the plant, it's not in the animal. If it's not in the animal, it's not in the human. Right. And so it starts with the soil. So in this meeting that I had with folks in Lancaster, there were about 40 farmers. And I said, how many of you feed your soil copper? How many out of the 40 farmers who were there, how many do you think rose their hand?
None.
2.
Oh.
Two. Which was exciting. And the one farmer was a Mennonite farmer, the other was an Amish farmer. And the Mennonite farmer said, what I want to encourage my fellow farmers to understand is you've got to measure the soil before you start to supplement with minerals. And he's absolutely right. Same with humans. Got to measure before you start to make changes. But his point was, he said, every time I've ever measured my soil, and again, got to think about Lancaster County, PA, one of the richest farm regions in the planet, right up there with California. And he said, every time I measure it, it's deficient. So I always add it. And I've got a training program, as I think you guys know. And one of the students who went through my program a number of years ago, he's a small grain farmer in Northern California. And he grows barley and radishes. And he grows award-winning barley and award-winning radishes. And he loves to make horseradish sauce, which will knock you on your keister, because he does one thing that none of his other farmers do. He sprays copper sulfate on the soil before he starts to plant. 10 to 15 pounds per acre. It's not a complicated formula. And he said it feeds the microbes that then put the copper into the root system of the plants. And his produce has the highest bricks content.
Yeah.
Yep. Which is the sugar content, right?
Are photosynthesizing the most.
Exactly. Yeah.
Pulling out of the air and pushing into the soil.
Exactly. And so what most people don't know, especially farmers, is what does it take to have photosynthesis? So you've got, do you know? There's three enzymes. Can you name them?
Carbon dioxide.
No.
Wait, enzymes in the
enzymes in the plant.
Oh no, I do not know this.
Okay. No, I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I just want to know if you knew. So there's photosystem 2, Roman 2, and there's photosystem Roman 1. Roman 1 was discovered before 2, but 2 is before Roman 1. You get that?
Yeah.
And then there's something in between them. It's called plastocyanin. Plastocyanin. Wait a minute. What's that plastocyanin thing? That's got copper in it. And it's taking the electrons from from photosystem 2, giving them to photosystem 1, and then recycling it so that it can go back and start all over again. And so photosynthesis does not work without bioavailable copper. Ding, ding, ding. And what is plastocyanin? That's the bacteria that started this whole mess 3.5 billion years ago. And every molecule of ceruloplasmin, which is the innate healer in our body, which we'll talk about more in the future, but it's called ceruloplasmin, biggest molecule in the human body. You know, it's got almost 1,500 amino acids in it, but it has 8 copper atoms in it. And what are they nestled in? A plastocyanin enzyme.
Okay.
So there's 8 plastocyanin in the plant and in the animals, and it's copper that's managing this flow of electrons. And it's absolutely amazing. And nobody seems to know about it. And so you can't have effective farming unless you're managing the flow of electrons that are coming from the photons from the sun, right? It's really important. And if the plants aren't happy, well, then the animals aren't going to be happy because they're not going to get what they need in the way of their nutrients. And it isn't just copper, but the problem we've got in farming is copper. It's the #1 nutrient deficiency. And why is that? Well, after the Second World War, they started to use up the armaments, which had a lot of NPK. So let's use that, okay? So what does that do? Well, what it does is it blocks the absorption of copper. What a coincidence.
Every
And
farmer now uses NPK fertilizer.
what's that?
Pretty much every single farmer right now uses NPK fertilizer.
We do what we're taught to do, right? And so they don't know, or they haven't been taught. And then we have the added insult now in the modern era of Roundup.
Mm-hmm.
And what does Roundup do? It's called glyphosate, fancy word. And I was at a meeting in Chicago a couple of years ago, and do you know Stephanie Seneff? Is that a name you're familiar with?
Mm.
But she's a world-renowned chemist at MIT, and she speaks a lot about glyphosate. And I'm at this breakfast table with her, and she said, "Morley, would you like to know why glyphosate is so bad? I thought I died and gone to heaven." I said, "Yes, I do." And I pulled my chair up, and she said, "It chelates copper down to a pH of 1."
I
So
had
what
no
is
idea
that?
glyphosate binds to copper.
Yeah. Well, it
No,
binds to a lot of minerals, but copper is its target.
no way.
Yeah, yes way. And what does pH of 1 mean? It means nothing stops it.
Yeah.
There's nothing on the planet that can stop glyphosate from chelating copper. Well, then there's more. So inside it's actually, I think I said 1,500 amino acids, like 1,660. But the point is, there are 16 amino acids in there that are called conserved glycine amino acids.
Where are they?
They're in the ceruloplasmin protein, very important. And when Dr. Seneff said that, I said, "Well, what does conserved mean?" She leans forward and she said, "It means they're really important, Morley." Okay, so what is glyphosate? It's a glycine molecule with a nitrogen wart. And so when the body is looking for glycine, it's not going to distinguish between glycine and glyphosate. It's going to take anything that looks remotely like it. And guess what? Glyphosate doesn't work when you're trying to make ceruloplasmin. So if there's anything that your listeners get from this initial conversation, it's stop eating processed food. It is poison. It's absolute poison. And if you're not getting your food from a farmer that you're looking in the eye and saying, how are you feeding your soil? How are you feeding your plants? How are you feeding your animals? If you're not getting a good answer back, then you shouldn't be eating their food. It's that basic.
Are organic farmers allowed to spray glyphosate?
There seems to be some equivocation about that. There seems to be some controversy. And now what's really an absolute fact is that organic farmers might be next to a conventional farm.
There's a lot of wind.
Exactly. A lot of wind. And so they have no control over that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of controversy around this, you can only imagine. And so we're being subjected to a mind-numbing experience on the farm. And, you know, there isn't enough crop rotation, there isn't enough diversity in the produce that's being made. And we could go on and on. But the real problem is when there's not enough copper in our tissue, our body accumulates iron. So when did we first learn that? That was a group up in University of Wisconsin in Madison, headed up by Dr. Hart. And in 1928, they fed little rodents, mice and rats. They fed them copper deficient feed, no copper. And what they discovered is that iron accumulated in their liver, like that. And so we are now witnessing, almost 100 years later, we're witnessing that experiment in vivo because we're all copper deficient. And then the iron gets stuck in our tissue. And that's where all the confusion is there's a difference between iron deficiency in the blood and iron dysregulation in the tissue.
So can I give like some analogy? So in, for example, the keto space, a lot of people measure their blood ketones. And so you think that that's a good marker of like how much their body's using ketones, when in reality, that's the ketones in your blood. That's not the ketones in your tissues. So it's similar, these blood tests that people perform to test your iron levels, that's your iron levels in your blood, not necessarily in your tissue.
That's exactly right. And
is
it's
there
very
any way to measure the amount of iron in your tissue?
There is. Let me explain the difference between iron in the blood and iron in the tissue, and then I'll come back to your question about how to measure it, because it's important for people to know that there is a measurement. But so we have iron in the blood, and we have iron in the tissue. They're not at all the same. And in fact, the iron in the tissue can be 10 times higher than the iron in the blood. Now, the team that figured that out is a very famous physiologist, Bruce Ames, at the University of UC Berkeley, and his assistant, Dave Kalilia. And in 2004, they were the ones that figured this out. Now, so Bruce Ames isn't just some wacko scientist. He was, during the heyday of his career, he was the most quoted scientist on planet Earth.
Wow.
So when Bruce Ames speaks, what did he just say? So when he says that there's 10 times more iron in the tissue, you need to pay attention to that. And so then it begs the question, Ashley, that you're asking, which is, how do we measure this? Well, there's two ways to measure it. You could do a needle biopsy, which is really painful. Do a needle biopsy of your liver, where they literally puncture it and take a core sample of the tissue and then study it. You first. Or you can do what's called a Tesla 2 MRI. The Tesla 2, it's also called T2 MRI. It's a very expensive test. Again, you first. But the leading clinicians and iron biologists all use the T2 MRI to measure iron in the liver, iron in the kidney, iron in the heart, iron in the pancreas, iron in the eyes, iron in the brain. You get the pattern here? And iron is all over our body. And there's also, if you use a Tesla 1 MRI, it won't show up. If you use a Tesla 3 MRI, it won't show up. Tesla 2, God knows why. I assume God does know why. It does show up. And it's really frightening when it does. Because people don't realize that their bodies are low copper, high iron, stuck in the tissue, doesn't show up in the blood, and then they're told to take more iron, thinking that that's going to solve the problem, and it won't.
So it's probably pretty safe to assume that if we all took a Tesla 2, we would show high iron level in our tissue.
Very likely. So if you've been told you were anemic, if you've been told you were amenorrhea, then you definitely have iron stuck in your tissue. And this is going to blow your mind and maybe your listeners' mind. Any condition that starts with the letter A: appendicitis, anemia, amenorrhea, and so on, atherosclerosis,
Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer's. All of those conditions are missing one nutrient.
Copper.
Well, it is copper, but you got to get to it first through vitamin A. And it's real vitamin A, retinol, that we get through animals that load copper into ceruloplasmin that allow for the prevention of these conditions that start with the letter A. Does that make sense?
So we have to have both vitamin A and copper. But
You
need
got it.
vitamin
That's
A
right.
and copper. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what happened in this country was President Eisenhower, this is well before your natal days, September 24th, 1955, he had a heart attack. The first of 8 heart attacks. And when he had a heart attack, the world was put on a low-fat diet. And we were told it was because we want to get cholesterol out of your system. Yeah. Booga bad cholesterol, right? No. They were trying to get rid of retinol because they knew how important it was for proper copper metabolism. And so the world goes on a low-fat diet. I'm betting before you started your journey, you probably had a low-fat diet. Your friends that you hung up with, low-fat diet. Your mother's low-fat diet. Your grandmother's low-fat diet. And you always wondered, when did all this start? It started back in 1955. And so there's all sorts of insanity that rules these decisions. But because retinol was taken out of our food, we've had low bioavailable copper, which causes high stored iron. And that's the whole mechanism. And when copper and iron aren't happy, when they're not where they need to be, then oxygen is not being regulated and not being harnessed properly. And when that happens, then we have oxidative stress, which is it's a fancy term for rust. Mm-hmm. The rust is building. And so I've got clients where the grandmother, the mother, and the child, all three have the same symptoms. And so what's happening is there's an acceleration of mineral deficiency through the generations.
So just to clarify for the listeners, you're talking about vitamin A from like beef liver, not this vitamin, not these other vitamin A sources that.
Right. I'm very fussy about where retinol comes from.
Yeah.
Not from supplement bottles.
Yeah.
You get it from beef liver and grass-fed beef liver, or you get it from cod liver oil. And there's only a couple forms of cod liver oil that I recommend.
What about egg yolks?
Excuse me, go ahead.
Egg yolks?
Yeah, oh yeah. But again, you're not going to get a lot through that source. It's a good source. But again, what are the chickens eating? If the chickens aren't eating grass, and if they're not eating bugs in the grass, you're not going to get good retinol in the egg yolk.
Yeah, if it's conventional, where they're just eating a bunch of corn and grain.
Exactly. So what they'll have on the egg box, on the egg carton, it'll say organically raised.
Or vegetarian fed.
Right. And that's like, no. I want the ugliest chickens on the ugliest farm eating grass and bugs because that's what Mother Nature wanted them to do. Now, what's fascinating is, why should chickens be eating grass and why should cows and other ruminants be eating grass? It's a really good question. It's fascinating. What's in this grass that's so important? Well, it's got a lot of nutrients, obviously. But there's one that's particularly important. It's called vitamin C. And I found this by studying, there's only 3 animals that can't make their own vitamin C. There's gerbils, hamsters, and primates, and humans. We're the only animals on the planet that can't make our own vitamin C. And I was reading an article, and then that led to research articles. I was reading an article about how you need to feed gerbils and hamsters, guinea pigs, you need to feed them grass so they get the vitamin C they need. It's absolutely amazing. So, yeah, there's vitamin C in the grass. And so what's in vitamin C? Well, vitamin C is not ascorbic acid. Don't make that mistake. And so real vitamin C,
Food vitamin.
whole food vitamin C, has 7 parts to it. But the engine of vitamin C is an enzyme called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase is one of the most important enzymes in our body. It's what gives us skin color, eye color, hair color, but it does a whole lot more. And melanin is very, very important. Well, you can't make melanin without tyrosinase. And what's inside tyrosinase? When you lift the hood on tyrosinase, there's 4 atoms of copper.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. And so Mother Nature knows all this, but it's not taught in ag school. It's not taught in med school. It's not taught in nursing school. Why? Because bioavailable copper kills the business model of medicine.
Biopharmaceutical.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's very
so
simple.
I have a question. So I'm gonna try to summarize. So we are all deficient in copper because our soil is depleted of copper and other essential vitamins and minerals.
Right.
So therefore, we're
Right.
eating significantly less of these. But if we flash back, like, I don't know, 1,000 years ago or so, we were consuming more copper. Did we have the same iron exposure? So I guess the problem is we have too much iron in our body and not enough copper to help deplete that iron. We've consumed less copper.
Like
Have
it's
we-
like the chicken and the egg, we also consume less vitamin A.
Yeah.
And low
That's
fat.
right.
Yeah, but we've
Exactly.
those minerals that help deplete the iron. Have we also been exposed to more iron? Is it both
Yes.
sides?
Yeah. So again, there's I don't remember her name. It's I think it's Dr. Levy. I could be wrong on that, but she did a study comparing the soil concentrations of minerals from 1930 to like 1985.
Okay.
And she found an 81% loss of copper. It was far and away the greatest mineral loss, and
Wow.
that's what prompted the phrase "copper is the #1 nutrient deficiency on the farm." So we've got this loss of copper in the soil, in the plants, in the animals, in the humans.
Yeah.
Then we have this building in the background, 1920s. Oh my gosh, women are anemic when they're, so you have to understand, at any given time, 1% of humanity is pregnant. 1%. And they decided to inoculate 100%. So they made a mistake. We'll just give them the benefit of the doubt. They made a mistake. Oh no, it's not really low iron. The body is just adjusting to the hemodilution, but they didn't go there. And so they decided to start fortifying, right?
Iron fortified.
Iron fortified foods. And then in 1941, everything changed. And this is written up in a book by an iron biologist named Jim, J-Y-M, Moon, PhD, 2008, Iron, the most toxic metal. And so what he discovered was that 1941 in the UK, in Canada, and the United States, they started adding iron filings, not organic iron, inorganic iron, started adding iron filings to the wheat flour. And it has not stopped. There are 9 different forms of iron being added to the US food system. How many of them are classified carcinogens? All 9 of them.
Oh, geez.
People don't know that. And so we are being exposed to iron in our food. We're being exposed to iron. There's speculation that the chemtrails that everyone's so worked up about, they're putting a lot of aluminum on the soil, which causes a preferential uptake of iron in the plants. That's something to be worried about. And then there's something called ferrous oxide that's used as a coloring agent in all medications. It's just another word for rust. And then we have supplements. The amount of iron that's in supplements is frightening.
Like birth control pills.
Like birth control pills, but like every kind of pill has ferrous oxide in it. And then, I was born in 1952, and I grew up in an era where you thought nothing of having sugar frosted flakes and Pop-Tarts, right? And so when you look on a box of sugar frosted flakes, you'll see that a half a cup will give you 18 milligrams of iron. You get 100% of your daily requirement, right?
Sweeties.
Well, who has a half a cup of sugar frosted flakes? You're going to have 2 cups if you're going to have any. So suddenly you're being exposed to 72 milligrams of iron every day. What's that?
You only needed one.
1 milligram.
You only need one. That's what you only need one. That's
Wow.
right. So it's, again, the numbers start going. Your head starts to spin. You're like, oh my gosh, we're being drowned in iron, and everybody thinks they're anemic, and everybody thinks there's iron. They're copper toxic. When in fact, the truth of the matter is, people are copper deserts, and they're drowning in iron in the tissue. And then that creates a whole series of events that come out like atherosclerosis and anemia and so on and so forth.
Can we touch on one thing that you mentioned about all of these foods that are fortified with iron? You mentioned that it's the inorganic iron. Can you touch on why that's a problem? Why it's the inorganic form that's the biggest problem, as opposed to, like, I mean, both would be an issue, but inorganic iron in these foods as opposed to organic iron.
Well, think about chewing on a steel pipe.
Yeah.
That's inorganic iron. And what they're literally doing is they're taking shavings from that steel pipe and putting it in. Does that sound like a good idea? And so what that does is it immediately causes rust inside our body. It's not complicated. And again, what we're struggling with right now is thinking, why would our government do that? Why would our health officials allow that? Why would our doctors not know about that? And there's a scale of this that you just have to come to a level of acceptance. You know, we're all still trying to process what COVID 1984 is all about. I don't know that we'll ever know. We're still arguing about the Spanish flu, and that was 100 years ago. But it's just, we're living in a very Byzantine time. Everything is upside down and backwards. And the most important thing is for people, by virtue of this conversation, the people who follow you, to understand that there is a serious problem in the minerals, in the soil, and in the food, and that there's mechanisms and that there's solutions that they can get access to. And that's really what the root cause protocol does, to try to allow people to rebalance and restore their minerals and their vitamin complexes. Because once you do that, there is an innate wisdom of the body. It knows exactly what to do.
Beautiful.
It didn't have the nutrients, and if it doesn't have the nutrients, it doesn't know what to do.
Okay, so
There's so many questions I have.
for the audience, we know about your root cause protocol because we're actually doing it right now. I think that you have presented that there's a huge problem, right? We're all sitting in iron and we're deficient in copper. What can we do about it?
Well, can I ask one more question?
Okay, we'll get to that in a second.
So you're proposed, how do we digest that our government and like our nutrition and agriculture puts iron shavings in our food? Like, where is this coming from? Why is our RDA 18 milligrams?
What happens is, the research that started back in the early 19 teens and then has been going forward, and now the World Health Organization makes this sweeping declaration that iron deficiency anemia is the #1 nutrient deficiency on the planet, ignoring the copper being the nutrient deficiency on the farm. We have this iron deficiency. Well, wait a minute. Does that really make sense? When I heard that the first time, I went, I knew enough about the planet to know that there's a lot of iron. Turns out that iron, 36% of the planet, Earth, is iron. It's the #1 nutrient on this planet. So let's argue that at least the three of us are, we're humans, right? And we'd like to think that humans are the most evolved species on the planet, right? Okay. So what that means is iron deficiency anemia means that the most evolved species on the planet has lost the ability to metabolize the #1 element on the planet. It doesn't pass the sniff test. So on the surface, it just doesn't make sense. But in the light of the research, Sarah, what's happened is people, especially people in scientific circles, they won't question some of the conclusions that are being drawn. I don't know why. I really don't. I don't understand it. How could anyone in their right mind condone glyphosate? It's an absolute poison. And so there's some I'd say what happens is at the margin, each decision that was made, well, let's add NPK. I'm sure there was a debate about that, but then it starts to get accepted, and then they start to incrementally add this, and then suddenly, it's like a game of telephone where the message that started out over here is completely different when it gets over to the last person in the chain. And what's happened is everything has become twisted and turned around.
I think an important thing to note there is, I've actually looked into this. I call it like the biocide cocktail. So conventional agriculture is just taught that you have to feed the plants this NPK fertilizer, and Roundup is okay. Some conventional farmers don't think that glyphosate is okay.
Right.
Starting to resurface, but it's all pushed towards them because guess who sells all of those things? Bayer. And Bayer was bought by Monsanto, and so like Bayer just
Monsanto was bought by Bayer. Bayer's
correct. Whoops. Yeah. So if you actually look at who's selling all of these fertilizers, these herbicides, these fungicides, glyphosate, it's like, oh, it's Bayer.
And it's important for people to be aware of it. We're not going to take on Bayer Pharmaceuticals.
No, good luck.
No, they've been around a long time. And so what my goal is through these types of conversations and the work that you all are doing independent of that is helping to educate and enlighten people that there's a completely different way, there's a completely different operating system than they're aware of. And the tragedy is this is not taught in doctor school. I tease doctors that their degree, their MD degree, stands for mineral denialist, because they think that minerals are hood ornaments, not the keys to the engine that run the car. And so that's where the real breakdown is. And so people just need to know that there really are some very profound mechanisms in our body that know exactly what to do when they're properly fed. And there's the terminology that's used in some nutritional circles is there's a hidden hunger in humanity. And we are becoming more and more aware of the need for these minerals and these vitamin complexes because they've been methodically drummed out. And taking a supplement, thinking that that's going to make it's like it's an insurance policy. No, it's not an insurance policy. It's a death warrant. There's some really bad chemicals in there, some really bad ratios, and people just don't know that, and so they'll pop a supplement thinking, well, I'm covering my bases with this, when in fact they're doing more harm than good. Because that's one of the protocol that I stole from Mother Nature. The protocol has a series of stops and starts, and one of the key stops is stop taking your supplements. They're not doing you any good.
What supplements are you referring to?
Well, things like one-a-days, wide class prenatals. I'm sure you have friends who are taking prenatals, not knowing what that's doing to their body, because they're afraid that they're iron deficient. They're afraid that they're vitamin D deficient. It's like, oh my gosh. It's like, no, you're not. You don't understand how the body works. And so here's a classic example. When a mother produces milk, right, for the baby, there's this much iron and there's this much vitamin D in naturally occurring mother's milk. Now, why do you think that is?
The baby already has what it needs.
Exactly. And the baby does not need that from mom, because that's what Mother Nature designed a long time ago. So what did Big Pharma do? What does Mother Nature know? We got to put lots of iron and lots of vitamin D so the baby gets. And they really believe they're helping people. It's again, the programming is so subtle and so deep and so insidious. People don't realize that they're being bombarded by messaging that is really not in their best interest.
So returning to what I said before she asked the last question, I think it's pretty clear have iron overload and low copper levels, and we're not going to change the system. We just can't. It's too big. What can our audience do to help rebalance this iron copper problem?
Do as I say. No, I've been focusing on this for a number of years, and about 4 years ago, I really zeroed in on this bioavailable copper. It's called ceruloplasmin, and the Swedish physiologist who discovered it, Holmberg and Laurel, they thought they discovered the Holy Grail. And it's 1948. They were just beside themselves. Well, Big Pharma's been demonizing it ever since. And so we have, 1,066 amino acids and 8 copper atoms, and it's like there's no other molecule in the human body that has that. And you probably didn't have a chance to read the articles that I sent over, but they were talking about myeloperoxidase and lipid peroxidase. Well, ceruloplasmin fillets MPO and LPO just for sport. And so when you have healthy levels of ceruloplasmin, you don't have histamine issues. Maybe that's for a subsequent conversation. So that's going to be important for people to realize that Mother Nature doesn't set us up for failure. It knows exactly what's needed. But this bioavailable copper is very, very important. And when we have that in our body, things hum. When we don't have that, it really becomes a problem. So I started to create what I called a protocol, and I had 2 stops and 2 starts. And now it's about a dozen stops and a dozen starts. And I think what people will be surprised when you go to the website rcp123.org, and you give us your email address, and we'll respect it. We're not going to start scamming you. But in exchange for that, we're going to give you access to a 32-page document that explains what this protocol is about and why we have these stops and why we have these starts. But the stops are going to surprise people because it says, stop taking iron supplements, stop taking calcium supplements, stop taking ascorbic acid, stop taking vitamin D, stop taking zinc, and stop taking your 1-a-day vitamins and a whole bunch of other things, because that is creating metabolic insanity in people's body. And they don't know that. They didn't realize that. And so we take a very contrarian view to a lot of the conventional recommendations. And then on the starts side, it's make sure that you are restoring minerals in your body through putting minerals in your water, that you're taking what we call adrenal cocktails, which are just nothing more than a form of vitamin C and salt and potassium, and is very rejuvenating for the body and for the adrenals especially. And guess where all of the steroid hormones are being made? They're being made in our adrenal glands, right? Mm-hmm. And so where's all the attention in medicine? The thyroid. Thyroid makes 1 hormone. The adrenal glands make 50 hormones. And so it makes perfect sense to obsess about the thyroid and lead people to think that the thyroid runs the body. It does not. That's an absolute lie. And have people ignore the adrenals. Well, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. It's mitochondrial dysfunction of the cells that make up the adrenal gland. And I just learned that this morning. It's absolutely fascinating. And so, the starts are really designed to begin to restore and rebalance the minerals and the vitamin complexes, vitamin A that we've talked about, the B vitamins that you really should be getting from beef liver or bee pollen or rice bran, and real vitamin C, not this foo-foo ascorbic acid that's made from GMO corn, mixed with sulfuric acid that people have no idea what they're doing. Vitamin D is absolute poison. I'll send over an article that I wrote, or it's actually the basis of a chapter. I'm working with a guest writer to help me get this message out. And I'll send you just what I wrote about vitamin D. And what I would encourage you both to do is have your feet in a magnesium foot bath so that your toes won't curl so much. Because when you find out what vitamin D really does inside the body, the supplemental D, you're just going to shake your head in wonderment. It's like, yeah, boom, like what are they doing to us? And so we get people to get real minerals, real vitamin complexes, nutrient-dense food like the grass-fed beef liver, or it can be organ meats in general, and the cod liver oil. And these are the foods that our ancestors grew up with. Our ancestors used to eat organ meats, and they threw the muscle meats to the dogs. And now we're so sophisticated. What do we eat? We eat the muscle meats, and we throw the organ meats to the dogs. We just don't get it. Organs are incredibly sophisticated tissue that has bazillions of mitochondria to make energy so they can do the job. So the organs that have it's called highest resting potential, means it never sleeps, means it's always doing something, right? It's the heart and the kidney, two organs that never stop.
Not the liver?
No, the liver actually goes through a cycle, and it's like a restaurant. And there's a time when the restaurant says we're closed and we got a clean house. It's not always working.
Okay.
And that surprised me, but the heart.
Open sign.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But the heart and the kidney, they never get to take a break because they're always working. And the number of mitochondria in the heart cells and the kidney cells, mind blowing. But yet we don't know that. And then the ones that I think are amazing, there's brain cells that we have. So we went through the heart 10,000, egg cells 600,000. There's a class of brain tissue called the substantia nigra. And this is the tissue that, if it gets iron toxic, leads to Parkinson's disease. There's a very specific region of the brain that causes, or that's in control of fine motor movement. What that starts to fritz out because of oxidative stress, then it doesn't make the dopamine that's needed to regulate the fine motor movement. 2 million mitochondria per neuron. Think about that. 2 million, and there's 900,000 neurons in the substantia nigra.
I need a high computing power computer to make that calculation.
And when does Parkinson's disease get diagnosed? When 66% of the neurons don't work. So that's about 660 neurons times 660,000 neurons times 2 million. It's an enormous breakdown of energy production in the brain.
Yeah.
And what people need to understand is that every condition on the planet, every syndrome, every malady, every label they've ever heard of, starts with energy deficiency.
Yeah.
And guess what doctors are not taught? They're not taught how to measure it, and they're not taught how to make it. It's an absolute disconnect between the perception we have of these very talented, very caring people, and their training is so scripted and so narrowly focused. If people knew how little they knew about mineral metabolism, oxygen metabolism, and energy metabolism, they would never go to a doctor again, because they don't understand how the body works. Because it's all about minerals and making sure that oxygen is being managed and that we can produce we can produce energy with it.
So is your cause protocol centered on optimizing the energy production?
Bingo, you got it. That's exactly what it is.
Involves moving the iron amount down and increasing the copper amount.
Exactly. Yeah.
In addition to, I encourage all of you to check out the root cause protocol. In addition
I will
to
link it below.
In addition to that,
Okay.
what are some better food sources that people should be doing so that they can rebalance that? So I know, for example, oysters have.
Can I just touch on the root cause protocol really quickly? So
Yeah.
we did download it, and I've been following it for about 4 months now. And so when I started, it was the start of our journey of trying to get our periods back. And I did get my period back, so I do attribute a lot of that success to rebalancing my minerals. People are going to ask, what specific supplement should I get? In the root cause protocol, you list all of your recommendations.
Yeah.
So that download has all of your questions answered, and there's even a Q&A for there too. So download that root cause protocol. It is going to be linked in the description below.
This will be a conversation for another day, but one thing that we did not do was the cod liver oil. And
I'm shocked.
That's a debate for another day. We decided to focus on getting our vitamin A from beef liver.
Okay.
He's like, okay.
Yeah. Just due to some feelings that we have about.
You're not following Matt Blackburn, who's influenced by Ray Peat, are you? And the Booga Wooga lipid peroxidation, are you?
Only slightly.
Okay. No, but and I understand that because Matt and I have had conversations about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't understand copper, if you don't understand bioavailable copper, if you don't understand the role that copper plays to energize all of the antioxidant enzymes, then you would be afraid of cod liver oil. So again, we will have that conversation because it's a very important understanding that people have. Like, we've been raised in a world. Think of it this way. I don't know what religion you are, but I was raised in a Christian household, and it wasn't oppressively. It just, I was Episcopalian, and I went to church from time to time. Well, the Christian church has a Bible, right? And there's a protagonist in the Bible, right? I think for the listeners out there that might be Christian, they know who that is. His name is Jesus Christ, right? So there's a protagonist in the Bible, and doctors, they also have a Bible. It's called the Merck Manual. But guess what? There's no protagonist in the Merck Manual. Because the protagonist is called bioavailable copper. And so every religion has a protagonist. It could be Muhammad, it could be Buddha. It doesn't. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but there is a protagonist. The Merck Manual, there's no protagonist. And doctors and society have been raised with this medical Bible that doesn't talk about copper, doesn't talk about bioavailable copper, doesn't talk about the fact that it harnesses oxygen and regulates iron. Call me crazy, but I think that might be a really good thing to know.
I think I might title this video, "Copper is the Jesus Christ of the body," or the Buddha.
Well, I mean, it's whatever you think, because I think we got to get people's attention that there really is a protagonist in our body. Wow. And we've been raised for the last 5 generations to think that we're broken.
Yeah.
That there's something wrong with us. And the operating channel that most doctors use is fear and intimidation. And they don't listen. They don't really understand, when did all this start. That's the most important question we ask in the training that we do with the Root Cause Institute is, when did your symptoms start? Like for you guys, when did the amenorrhea start? That's a really important question to ask, because that's where the stress started that caused the symptom. Yeah. There's no disease process. That's mythology. So it's a very different way of looking at the body and understanding how beautifully designed it is and how responsive it is, and it really becomes very resilient when it has the nutrients that it needs to run. Yeah. And it's an important message for people to grasp that. And again, I started the conversation with, your listeners are not broken, but they are out of balance. And it's important for people to realize that the body will respond. And it's also important, just to reinforce this point, because people I know are going to jump to the protocol, and most people like to get well yesterday, right? And they're going to do everything at once. And it's really smart to ease into it. I know that sounds really frumpy, but it's important to do that. But there are some roadblocks that can get in the way of the protocol from working. One of them is people who are unable or unwilling to donate blood. Now, what's fascinating about the difference between men and women is you're able to donate blood on a monthly basis, right?
I went in to donate blood like 3 years ago, and I couldn't because I wasn't healthy enough.
You were anemic.
Right.
Yeah.
You were anemic. Your hemoglobin was too low. But there's only 2 reasons why women outlive men. 2 reasons. Women are smarter. That's an established fact. That's an established fact. And healthy women have a normal monthly blood loss for 40 years. And so guys don't have that.
Yeah.
Our ancestors used to get hurt on the farm and they would bleed, and their ancestors would get hurt on a field in a battle and they would bleed. But in the modern era, we don't have that. And so there's an enormous buildup of iron in a man's body from cradle to grave, unlike in a woman's body. So donating blood is really important. So for women who are in menopause or guys, should be going every quarter to donate blood. For women who do have a menstrual cycle, I recommend it once or twice a year. And if they don't have healthy hemoglobin, there's things that we can do to deal with that, which we can talk about at a subsequent conversation. But getting rid of lowering the iron footprint is a really important step to allow the protocol to work. Second thing that can get in the way, which you were keying in on in some of your emails yesterday, around histamines, and we can do a deeper dive on those as well. But histamines will get in the way. And we've been trained, like circus bears, to believe that cortisol is the stress hormone. That's not the stress hormone. It's actually histamines. Histamines are incredibly powerful, and they're responding to oxidative stress. And what's really important is for people who do have environmental sensitivities or food sensitivities, you need to get those cleared. And a really good way to do that is with NAET. N is the name of a doctor, not naturopomade, something to that effect, allergy elimination technique. And there are practitioners all over the planet that do that. In Illinois and in the States, there are practitioners who do what's called allergy elimination technique, and it's allergytx.com. And it's a computer-based system. NAET is muscle testing, but allergy elimination or the Allergy TX, it's a very cool system. And if people can get access to it, it'll really help to clear. These are not lifelong problems. They can be cleared in short-term intervention. It's important for people to know that a histamine response is an error message that can be corrected. Then third, and maybe the most important roadblock to getting the protocol to work is unresolved emotional issues. And when people get sick, especially if they have chronic conditions, they begin to doubt themselves, they begin to doubt their body, they begin to get very angry about it at times. And without question, it's a very understandable reaction. So that when we have these blocked emotions, they will begin to trigger fear. It's written up in the literature. It's a very common problem. We all went into a state of fear back in March when the COVID thing started. We can all remember how that felt. It was very disorienting, and to some extent it still is. And so fear causes the body to contract. It causes our pH to become acidic. Well, any farmer will tell you that acidic soil attracts iron. So when we're in a state of fear, and I spell it differently, I spell it Fe-AR, so people can see the symbol for iron. So when we go in a state of fear, iron starts to build in the body. So fear attracts iron. Then there's a research team in Japan, Nakamura and his team in 2016 discovered that iron activates the danger sensor of the cell. And it's a protein called NLRP3. So what do we have? We have a complete cycle. Fear attracts iron, iron activates fear. And it becomes a vicious circle. And so what I encourage people to do is with a practitioner is to do emotional freedom technique to slice through that cycle of fear so that people can release the emotions. Let me give people a really graphic example so they understand what I'm talking about. So when I was 6 years old, my dad was suffering with manic depression and schizophrenia, and they were going to do electric shock therapy for the second time. And for those of you who might have seen Cuckoo's Nest, you know how intensely unsettling that procedure is. And my dad said, that's not going to happen. And he ran away from home, never to come back. So what do you think a 6-year-old little boy thought when his father ran away from home?
Wow.
I thought I'd caused it.
Yeah.
It's because little 6-year-old boys think they're God. And so I thought I'd caused my dad to leave. And so I carried that issue for 55 years. I've been to different therapists, short-term therapy, blah, 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 but never really resolving it until I worked with a therapist in California doing EFT. And in 2 sessions, boom, I let go of the event, the electrical charge that that event had over me. I still know that my dad left. He never came back to the home, but it doesn't cause my body to twitch inside because I've let it go. And everyone has a different story. I've done over 6,000 consults, and at some point, people will get to their story. What was the real crisis of their life? And that's when the problems start, and then they just build on that. And it's important for people to take the time, take the initiative, but you've got to work with a practitioner. EFT for yourself does not work.
Yeah.
Why? Because people with high IQ have 2 genetic defects. We're control freaks, right? No, it's a fact. And we love complexity. We absolutely love complexity. We love untying complicated knots. And so people who have high IQ don't know how to let go. And that's why you work with a practitioner, because it's more complicated.
Yeah.
You're going to love that, but you're going to let go of whatever the emotional charge is that's at the very core of your unrest. And you let that go, it's absolutely life-changing. And so those are some of the cornerstones of the protocol that really help people to maximize the benefit of the nutrients that are focused on in the protocol itself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Somebody should probably start there then.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it would be a wonderful place to start.
Yeah.
And not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody is willing to open up their Pandora's box of emotions. Most people won't do it, but over time they will. And what I can tell you is that when they do, their recovery takes off like a rocket.
Yeah. And you said it took you 2 sessions. What did you experience after your second session?
Just relief. It was just a sensation of calm that I don't know that I'd ever had before. And because again, I was blaming myself.
Yeah.
And what I was able to learn how to do was let go of that. I didn't have anything to do. I mean, it's absolutely absurd that a 60-year-old guy still thought he caused his father to leave home. It's like, no. And even though I could rationalize it, I couldn't say it and actually believe it. But now I know it to be, it's almost farcical to look back on it.
Yeah.
When I think about it.
Well, first, I'm very sorry that you experienced that.
Well, no, I appreciate that, but the important thing is, it's what allowed me to be who I am.
Yeah.
It's what inspired me to look deeper, and so would I change that? Actually, I wouldn't, because it really helped shape me as a person, and it's really helped me be very compassionate with people. I've heard stories I didn't think would be possible. Absolutely mind-numbing stories of strife within a home or within someone's job, or related to physical events of their life. And it's like, and I realized, oh my gosh, everybody. Because when you're younger, you think, well, I'm the only one who had this problem. When in fact, we've all had these problems. Everyone on the planet. It's like one of the first boxes you check with St. Peter before you come down. Give me a big dose of stress and I'll be fine. And it's like, and so people just need to understand that that's part of the human drama, is having stress.
Yeah.
And what was important for people to realize is that when we're under stress, and we're all under stress, is we're burning through minerals. And the mineral that gets lost the fastest is called magnesium. And that's why I call it the magnesium burn rate. Life just burns through magnesium in a second.
In another conversation, because I think that's a mark that a lot of people miss, in addition to the copper deficiency and iron overload.
Absolutely.
I speak a lot about that.
Yeah.
Well, that was really beautiful because I
Yeah.
know my dad's gonna love that because he always preaches that like anything you've gone through made you into the person that you are today.
Yeah.
Very
Absolutely.
just embrace
No.
them.
And the thing is, it's important for people to realize that these events that happen to us, they're not being done to us, they're being done for us. And that we can use those as stepping stones to our own development, our own awareness about what's going on. And I know, trust me, I've been through the heartache and all of the challenges that come with it. But it's important for people to step back and realize everybody's going through this in some level, in some fashion. And it's not to minimize the crisis that you're facing, but that we all face a crisis or a series of crises, and it's part of our journey. And it's really, it's grist for our mill to develop as more enlightened beings as we go through life.
I think it gives you a path of how you can help others too.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. And so what this has become for me is this started out as a lark. 11 years ago, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. So yeah, right. I'll study magnesium, and then it became a hobby. And actually, what it's grown into is now I'm doing my life's work. I'm honored to have these types of conversations and share this information. And my purpose in life is very simple. My purpose is to help people get over the physical barriers that are keeping them from their purpose in life.
I love
And
that.
so, yeah. And so we were not put on this planet to worry about amenorrhea or gallbladder disease or heart disease or whatever it happens to be. There's an issue, some social issue or some family issue or something that each of us is meant to do that we're uniquely qualified for. And we can't do it as long as we're worrying about some physical problem in our body.
Yeah.
And so let's liberate the body. Let's get past all that so we can really connect with source and find out what are we supposed to do, and let's get on with it. And it's fantastic. And people who do the protocol are just amazed at the energy they get, and that they can then really focus their attention to what they really want to do.
Yeah.
That's really what it's about.
I really appreciate your work, and I really encourage other people to go check out the root cause protocol. So I think in this conversation, we really only touched on one of Morley's, one of the main points, which is the iron overload and copper deficiency. We'll get into many other points in future discussions, but let's say someone is not yet ready to start the root cause protocol. What are some take-home steps that people can do to help rebalance that? And I know it's unfortunate that, you hear people say like, let food be thy medicine, but we touched in this that our soil is kind of depleted of nutrients. So unfortunately, our nutrient levels aren't as high as they were before. What are some take-home steps that some people can do to help move that iron down and increase that copper?
Right. So it's actually easier to get people to change their religion than to change their diet. And I'm sure you guys have experienced that with people that you've worked with. So that's an important starting point. And again, it's not to make wholesale changes. Don't become a macrobiotic specialist, overnight. It's like, no, we don't need to do that. But you can begin to make changes incrementally. Start to lower the amount of sugar in your diet. It's not helping you. Start to be very mindful of, do the food that you're eating, is the food that you're eating, does it have minerals in it? And are you adding minerals to your water that you're drinking, the water that you're cooking with? You can do that very simply. Are you properly mineralizing your food with salt? It's a really important ingredient. The advent of refrigeration took 2/3 of the salt that our ancestors had in their diet. Right, because they stored meat with salt. It was a preservative. So we lost a lot of exposure to salt. That's very, very important. So people can begin to, don't be afraid of salt. That doesn't cause high blood pressure. It's actually, it's so much confusion around that. But the important thing is making sure that people feel comfortable and that they're able to, salt the food in a way that it's going to be pleasing. If this is prime season for watermelon, right?
Yeah.
We're coming. What's the first thing you should do to a watermelon once you slice it up? Salt it.
Oh, I do. It's so good. It tastes so good.
Because it enhances the sweetness, right? It's really important. I used to, as a little kid, I would watch my mom's dad. he would salt his melons before he ate them. I was always fascinated by that. And now I know why. It's like, it took me a long time to figure it out. But those are simple things people can do. They can begin to, wherever possible, make conscious choices about eating foods that are in season.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big step. If you live in Wisconsin or Illinois, why would you be using coconut oil? How many coconut trees are there in your backyard? So why don't you use butter? Because that's natural to the area. So eat foods that are local to the area. And I'm not criticizing the medium chain triglycerides. I know why they're important, but think about what is natural to the area that you're from. Be aware of your ancestry. I think a wonderful cookbook that people can purchase. They can get really inexpensive copies online. Sally Fallon's Nourishing Traditions. It's an amazing cookbook. Has a lot of just a ton of really practical recipes that people can begin. Just do that once a week. Do a Sally Fallon meal once a week.
Yeah.
The other thing that people can do is, what Dr. Liz and I do now is we only have 2 meals a day. We have a breakfast sometime between 9:30 and 10, and then we'll have dinner around 5:30 or 6. And we don't need as many calories. Now that's in part because we're a little bit older, but even, I'm sure you've heard of intermittent fasting. We overeat as a civilization. We don't eat as much food as we think we do. So that's another thing that people can do. That they've done studies that when you cut back as much as 30% of the calories in a diet, the animals that experience that live 30% longer.
Do you think that has to do with just not being overweight at a certain point?
Well, it also has to do with less oxidative stress inside the body. Anytime we've got fuel to burn, we're going to burn it with oxygen. We're going to be creating oxidative stress. And if we can't neutralize it, then we're going to have a problem. I think the other thing that people can do, again, assuming that people are healthy, at some level of a modicum of health, they can start to donate blood.
Yeah.
And the studies that the Red Cross and other blood centers have done over the years is they've studied people who are regular blood donors versus people who don't donate. And hands down, every time, it's the regular blood donors that outlive the non-donors. So it's lowering the iron footprint. Another thing that people can start to do is start to read the labels of the food they're eating.
Yeah.
The classic recommendation is, if it doesn't read like a recipe, then you shouldn't be eating it.
Yeah.
If it's got big words in it and it looks complicated, then that's probably not a food that you want to eat.
It's like processed foods, just like, nope.
Yeah, the processed foods were designed for a shelf life, not human life. People don't understand that.
What about foods that are high in copper?
Well, can we touch on the calories really quickly? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Very fine line to walk, because in the dieting culture within our generation,
For females
are eating less and less calories, and I agree with a lot of the concept of intermittent fasting and how powerful it can be, because we fasted a lot in our healing stages 2 to 3 years ago.
It's a tool, but you can't
It is.
not abuse it.
For some people who put themselves through a lot of stresses, that it could actually add oxidative stress if they could otherwise relieve some of that stress by eating easy to digest and nutrient dense foods.
Yeah, I always when we talk about fasting and caloric restriction, we always like to provide a context. So for a young female who is trying to be fertile and has been through some eating disorder pasts and has always been small and maybe lost their period, I don't personally think that caloric restriction and fasting is the best idea for.
I totally agree. Yeah.
But I think that it really changes. And there are some people who can eat X amount of times per day and still be below their body's caloric needs and eat an appropriate amount of calories per their body. And then some people where intermittent fasting works well. But I do also know some people where they do intermittent fasting, but then when they get to that eating time, they feast and they binge and they gorge. And so I think it's just always important to figure out, how can you live a sustainable lifestyle where you can eat a calorie amount that's appropriate for your goals?
I think that's
absolutely agree.
Yeah,
absolutely agree. And I think that the caloric needs of a younger individual, someone who's in their 20s and 30s, it's very different than someone who's in their later 60s. I can tell you that because I'm not as active. You know, and I think it's important for people to realize that at that developmental age, you know, when you're in your 20s and 30s and you want to start families and things like that, very important to have the right nutrition. The other thing where I think people cut corners is I don't think people are getting the right kind of protein, and I don't think they're getting enough fat. I think that's where people are really losing out by a lot of the different eating regimens that are being promoted. Got to be really careful about that because it's if the body can't rebuild itself, you know, and the energy production by eating fat is vastly different than the energy production by eating carbohydrates. They're completely different in terms of their capacity to generate fuel and energy for the body.
That's so interesting. We'll have to talk about that in a future one too, because I know that we follow a lot of Ray Pete's recommendations, and I know that you recommend a more low-fat diet. So it's just another topic to dive.
Low carb diet.
Low carb diet.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
On protein sources and eating higher fat. That's another thing I love about Sally Fallon's cookbook. It's educated throughout. So if somebody didn't really have a background in nutrition, they could purchase that book, read her little comments, and understand why it's good to eat higher saturated fats and what proteins to focus on and how to balance those amino acids.
Yeah.
So I really recommend that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a wonderful source of information. And I think to me, Dr. Price's work is the bedrock for human nutrition. The research that he did with his wife over that in the 1920s, very, very important. And when I think people, if they're looking for something to do, that'd be a great book to read. One of the most important books I've ever read, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And if you haven't read it and don't understand what drove him, then you don't understand how to interpret all the different pundits in the modern era. Because again, that's the bedrock of understanding how the body works with nutrients, is Dr. Price's work. And then once you have that as a foundation, then you can begin to experiment with other approaches. But you really need to understand how the body is designed to really work with nutrition.
See, we like to say that we're kind of a blend of Weston Price and Ray Peat, because we have realized, like, fat soluble vitamins A, D, K2, like, you've got to have your good raw animal fat sources. Like, we prioritize those. We don't skimp on our fat. But then we're also incorporating some of Ray Peat principles in healing some issues that we've had. So it's there's some conflicting things, but I think that, like,
well, what he just said is that's the foundation.
Exactly.
I agree.
Yeah.
And we can talk about those. I'm not averse to talking about controversy. I mean, I think that's important for people to know that not everyone agrees.
Yeah.
But let's talk about where we do agree, and let's talk about why we don't agree, and get down to the real points of difference of opinion.
Yeah.
And again, as I shared, Ashley, in our conversation, one of my favorite lines of all time is from Ray Peat, who said, "Sunlight is what keeps copper from becoming iron." And I love that statement. It took me about 2.5 years to figure out what he was talking about. But it's a very important understanding about what sunlight does, not to make vitamin D, but to catalyze retinol. And once you understand that, then it's like, oh my gosh. And again, I really attribute my pursuing the development of the root cause protocol to the article that I read by Ray Peat, who said, to my knowledge, no one's ever developed a protocol to build ceruloplasmin. And I said, I think that's what I'll do. And that article inspired me to do this. And I'm very grateful to him. It doesn't mean I have to agree with everything he says, and he doesn't have to agree with everything I say. But what I've come to learn is that once you get down to copper and iron and oxygen, that becomes this primal relationship that dictates, are we going to be in balance or not in balance? And everything keys off of that. Absolutely all the steroid hormones, all of the mechanisms of metabolism. It's absolutely amazing how important that oxygen thing is, and how effectively it's being either carried or chopped up by copper. Really important.
The way that I describe, like, your work is people can debate about whether we should be fat fueled or carb fueled, but we won't operate well with either of those fuel sources if we don't fix the micronutrient problem first. So like, the mineral problem first. So like, why are we so focused about the macronutrients? Let's solve this deeper issue first. And then you can go figure out the other. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting. At some level, we can almost say, is it possible for both Ray Peat and Weston A. Price to be right? I don't know. I think that's a very provocative thought, that we have this legendary figures, both of them, proposing very different approaches.
Yeah.
Which is very provocative to think about.
Yeah.
I think it also begs the question: can they both be right? I don't know. I think that might be a fun conversation to have downstream.
Similarities between the two.
Yep.
Kind of cross over and get to more of the root problems that you're talking about in your root cause protocol. So perhaps what she was saying is like, it doesn't matter as much that level as opposed to what is down here in the minerals.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah. And I think it's important for people to, one of my students' husband is a pastor, and he teaches a course in logic to his parishioners so they can have discussions and debate about the Bible without having arguments. It's really cool. So the cornerstone of his course, though, is missing information equals missing truth. And I think what's happened in society is there's so many potholes of missing information that people don't realize they're missing the truth of the matter. And if you don't understand oxygen metabolism, if you don't understand copper metabolism, if you don't understand iron metabolism and how interdependent they are, then it's impossible to settle on what is truth in the body, because you're missing these major cornerstones of information. So I think that's what, and again, no one has total command of the information. But what I've really labored to do is delve into the research to find the real critical pieces of information that have been lost to the ages, to find out, so why did Warburg and Krebs not talk more about the copper ion dynamic in those birds that they bled? You know, why don't we know who David Kylan is, who is this incredibly luminary figure? And you know, why don't there's some amazing figures that had important information that got swept under the rug of science because they wanted people to know this information. It's not necessarily the truth, but they wanted us to know this, but not know what was under the rug. And what I'm doing is pulling back the rug and saying, wow, there's a lot of stuff there. We ought to be talking about that too.
It's fascinating. I love all of your work, and I think that it's really thought-provoking and just makes people, I like that it encourages people to question things, because I think that that's what we should all be doing anyways.
Well, one of that phrase, missing information equals missing truth, one of the most important things I heard this year. And last year, I had the good fortune of meeting a world-renowned marketing expert who works in natural healing. And his name is Michael. And people always asking Michael, what's new? What's new? And he said, actually, what he's learned to do is ask, what's enduring? And when he shared that with me, I was, wow. And so I took it to heart, and I started thinking about what is enduring? What's been, well, minerals have been on the planet for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's what got me to the great oxygen event 3.5 billion years ago, to find out why copper was so important. So my tendency is to go back in time. What were they researching back in the 1910s, 20s, 30s? Because they were really smart back then.
That's a similarity with Ray Peat there.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, he has command of the literature. And so I'm really trying to get a sense of what's enduring and what's missing from the modern perception of truth. That's really what it boils down to.
Okay. I have one final wrap-up question about the main topic of this conversation, which is the iron overload and copper deficiency. So if someone were to avoid iron fortified foods, so reduce their iron intake and donate blood, will that naturally rebalance, or should they also be consuming high Copper foods.
Well, that's what the root protocol is for.
Yeah, I think it is a tag team approach. It's important to do both sides.
Okay.
And again, is there benefit from avoiding iron fortified foods and doing blood donations? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But ultimately, what I think you all are beginning to understand, and what your listeners are going to find out, and people that are doing the protocol, what we're discovering is just how much stored iron we really have.
Yeah.
What mobilizes that iron is bioavailable copper. And once you start to introduce that element into your diet, and when I say bioavailable copper, it's code for retinol and copper, because you're not the only ones that didn't like cod liver oil, but you got to get your retinol from someplace.
Yeah.
And the body is set up in a very basic fashion to, once it has access to this copper, it knows exactly what to do with the iron. And so people need to work both sides of the seesaw.
Okay.
Really, really important to recognize that they're connected.
Each oysters.
Eat your oysters, yeah. No, but again, not everybody likes oysters.
Yeah.
Again, it's these nutrient-dense foods that most people are repulsed by are what our ancestors ate.
Liver, oysters, other organs. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, my mom grew up in the country, and we would have some really wild stuff, and she wanted us, and we would have shad roe. Okay, I can handle that. And liver and kidney, yeah, I got that. Tongue, got that, no worry. Then she said, well, we're going to have brain tonight. And I said, no, we're not. I couldn't do it.
We like brain.
Yeah, and now it's like, I'm very, very open to that. It's just when you're a little kid and you're being exposed to stuff, it's like, and none of my friends were eating brain.
Yeah.
But the thing is, most people were not raised with that country diet.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really mindful of that. And it is a gradual process to move people to a more natural, nutrient-dense diet.
We were raised, and I know many people were raised on a grocery store diet.
Yeah, no, that's true. Frozen food. I remember TV dinners. I mean, I've been there, done that. And so, again, if I can turn around my battleship, then people who aren't exposed to that can certainly can turn their battleship around. But it does take time.
Yeah.
And it takes discipline to do it. And the purpose of the protocol is to give people a roadmap. And then, if I realized that I couldn't, solve all the problems, so I started training people to start thinking like I do. It's kind of a scary thought. But there are a lot of people out there. There's several hundred people now who are trained to help people through this process. And not everyone does it to be a coach or a consultant. A third of the people that go through the training are moms that just want to take care of their family.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Another third are practitioners who want to take their practice to another level. And another third are folks like you and me that they just want to help people. They just want to have the awareness of what to do. So it's a different language. And once you learn the basics, it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And then you're able to really support people in the process of transition.
Well, awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm looking forward to our next few conversations as we break through some other misconceptions.
Can you believe we've been talking for 2 hours?
No, it's crazy.
It's been 2 hours.
Yeah.
I did my adrenal cocktail. It's time. I gotta go.
This is better than an adrenal cocktail, right?
Tell our audience, in addition to the, what is it, rcp123.org.
.org, yep.
In addition to that website, where else can they find you or reach you?
I'm on Facebook at the Magnesium Advocacy Group.
Okay.
That started that, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, whenever. But people who want to reach out, they're welcome to reach me by email. It's my first and last name, Morley Robbins @gmail. And for those courageous few that like to call me, my phone number is area code 847-922-8061. Yeah, I used to be in Evanston, for those of you who know what 847 means. But held on to that number, and happy to take your call. I actually learned it from one of my CEO hospital clients. I was like, dude, you've got your cell phone on here. He says, relax, Morley. Only people who have a real crisis call me. And I thought, what the heck? I'm going to try. And really, people are very respectful of my time.
Yeah.
And not very few people will do it. But the people who do reach out, it's important that we talk, and I'm always happy to take those calls.
I called you and I had a
Yeah.
fun.
No, I'm glad you did. We wouldn't have spent these 2 hours with as much fun, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we end all of our YouTube videos. We are ridiculous. We know. We're going to say on the count of 3, we're going to say 1, 2, 3, behave like a angel. We know it's wrong, but it's just something that we do at the end. Okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Behave like
Like a
angel.
you know,
There you go. All right. Thanks, Marley.
you bet. That's great.